Welcome, viewers and listeners, to CHP Talks. I'm speaking to you from Manitoba, and I'm speaking with our guest, Josph Benamy, who is in Ottawa. So, Josph, thank you for joining us again on CHP Talks.
Thank you for having me.
So, for those who maybe didn't catch our first interview with Josph quite some time ago, I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction. Widely regarded as one of Canada's leading conservative activist voices, Josph Benamy is a senior partner at Ditchley Public Affairs, specializing in strategic communications, political marketing, and fundraising for conservative causes and candidates for public office. A former naval officer, Josph has extensive experience in strategic planning and communications in both the private sector and the political arena, and has held senior positions in several local, provincial, and national political and advocacy campaigns. From 2008 to 2014, he was president of the Arthur Meighen Institute for Public Affairs, a conservative-oriented think tank. Prior to joining the Meighen Institute, he was executive director of the Institute for Canadian Values, and before that, director of government relations and diplomatic affairs for the well-known Jewish human rights group B'nai B'rith. He has served on numerous organizational boards, including the Advisory Board of Jews Against Anti-Christian Defamation. Josph Benamy served as a policy and communications aide to Stephen Harper, Canada's former Conservative Prime Minister, as well as Stockwell Day, Harper's predecessor as party leader. He also served as a consultant speechwriter for several senior executives and political officials. A couple of years ago, Josph Benamy led Brad Trost's national campaign for the leadership of the Conservative Party of Canada, and he is a director at bluecommittee.org. He is a respected television and radio commentator and regular public speaker, offering insights on public policy and current affairs from a conservative perspective. When not writing or speaking himself, he is sharing his expertise, training, and consulting on political and issues campaigns, speech writing, media relations, and communications. He also lectures widely on subjects such as civic engagement and leadership. And also, I am happy to call Josph Benamy a friend, and we've had contact over the years, sporadic as it is, because he's in Ottawa and I'm in British Columbia most of the time. But anyway, very grateful for you to take the time to speak with us today, Josph.
Thank you very much for having me, Rod.
Yeah.
Long introduction.
Yeah, well, it's okay. I think people deserve to know what you've been up to over the years and why I think it's important for people to hear from you today. So what I want to address, it's kind of the elephant in the room, I suppose, is the Israel-Hamas conflict, what's going on in the Middle East, your perspective as a Jewish person, and any wisdom and insight on that issue, and of course, ultimately, how can we resolve the issues without bloodshed? That would be a great end in itself. But maybe give us your broad perspective on what's going on there today.
Well, Rod, thank you very much for the question, and it's a huge question. There are just so many angles to it and different perspectives that you could approach it from. Yeah, simply put, I guess a starting point would be the attacks that Hamas mounted on Israeli civilians on October the 7th. And it's difficult to imagine, let alone grasp fully, not just the magnitude of the attacks, but the depravity of them. I'm sure that your listeners and viewers have already heard this over and over again, so I'm not going to repeat the kinds of things that went on, but let's just say that when I use the term depravity, that's absolutely what I mean. And so, this was the single greatest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. And it was bound to provoke a ferocious reaction from Israel, and that's what you're seeing now. A determination, and there's a context to this as well, a determination to eradicate the threat that Hamas as an organization poses to Israel and to the Jewish people worldwide. That's what you're seeing now. But when I say there's a context to this, I think it's important for people to remember that Israel withdrew from Gaza. It was a territory that Israel controlled for a number of years, starting in 1967. There were a number of small Jewish communities that had planted themselves in that region, and it's a very small region. We call it the Gaza Strip for a reason because it's very small. But the Israel forcibly withdrew Jews from that region as well. And as an aside, because the Palestinian Arabs, the leaders of the Palestinian Arabs, have been very adamant that any entity that they control, they don't want Jews living there, period, full stop. So even though that there had been several generations of Jews who were settled in small communities, small villages in that region, the Israeli government took it on itself, the responsibility to forcibly evict those people from their homes and give the territory 100% lock, stock, and barrel back to the Palestinian Authority. Of course, then they have an election, or a pseudo-election, as I like to call it, and the people choose to be led by Hamas, which is nothing more than, frankly, a criminal organization, not unlike what the Nazis were in Germany at the time. Nevertheless, they control the situation. Now, since Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005, they've fought now 5 major engagements. This is the 6th against Hamas. One wonders exactly what is it that they want. You want to establish your own, you have your territory, you have complete independence. What exactly do you want? So this was really the straw that broke the camel's back. So it's a kind of a perfect storm, what happened on October the 7th. It was yet another attack, unprovoked. The depravity of it and the scale of it was unprecedented, and it's multiple times that this happened. And I'm not even referring to the regular small terrorist infiltrations that come from that territory over the years, or the ongoing periodic unprovoked rocket attacks that are fired from Gaza over the years. The government in Israel's just had enough. And more precisely, they've had enough of the international community lecturing them on how to protect themselves. Every time they engage with Hamas on a military level, the world cries out for a ceasefire. The Israelis agree, they withdraw, and then the international community doesn't step up and do anything to preserve the peace or enhance the security of anyone. And, we're talking about Israel and we're talking about Jews, but the people that really suffer and the people who are very much suffering right now are residents of Gaza themselves.
Yeah.
I'm not going to beat around the bush. I'm going to say that the people in Gaza, while we like to talk about innocent civilians, but at some point in time, you have to accept the consequences for the decisions that you're making. And if you want to be governed by this criminal terrorist organization, and if you want to celebrate in the streets for when they attack Israelis and Jews, then at some point in time, there are going to be consequences to this. And I know that's not politically correct, but all I have to do is point to Germany's civilian population that suffered during the Second World War tremendously. But and I don't mean to sound cavalier. I'm not. But I do think that people in Gaza have to start accepting responsibility for the consequences of the actions they take or don't take. And I'm not unsympathetic to the difficulty, because you can't really, it's hard to rebel against this organization. They are brutal. They brook no dissent. But there you have it. The responsibility of the state of Israel is to protect its citizens. It's not to appease world opinion all the time, which they've been doing all along.
Right. So one thing you mentioned is people get when they vote for a wicked ruler or a wicked government, consequences, they don't always foresee the consequences. Like in Canada, many of the people that voted for Mr. Trudeau, I mean, we are all suffering the consequences of that decision. But they weren't expecting, they weren't promised, inflation, carbon taxes, all kinds of things like that. They were promised, a feel-good environment, and so people are sometimes deceived by political entities.
Yeah.
When was the last election in Gaza? Do you know when the last?
Well, they've never had another election.
They had one
They've
election.
never had this.
Yeah.
Once very similar to what happened with the National Socialists in Germany. Once they used they used democratic procedure to capture the infrastructure of political power, and then they simply suspend whatever constitution. Of course, Gaza didn't have a constitution, but and consolidate their power. So there's never been another election.
Yeah. So
And you cannot, and of course, once Hamas took control over the government that was emerging in Gaza, they simply executed all of their political opponents, and that's the way it's been. So it's been quite a brutal dictatorship. You know what they do to people, gays and lesbians in Gaza. The standard method of execution, because homosexuality is against the law in that territory, and the standard method of execution is to take them to the tallest building and toss them off. I mean, and this is standard procedure.
well,
And these are the people that the world, in its naivete, continues to indulge the fantasy that you can actually make peace with these people.
yeah.
Well, you can't make peace with them. We've tried.
Yeah. Concessions are only an invitation to further invasion and encroachment, right? So,
Right.
and you mentioned early that that Jews are not welcome in Palestine. If you're a Jew, moving to Palestine is not an option if you want to stay alive. On the contrary, there are Palestinians living in Israel, right, and working in Israel. Is that correct?
There are in Israel itself, there are something around around 2.5 million Arab citizens. If you want to call them Palestinian, that's fine. Palestine is a geographical term; it's not an ethnic term.
Right.
But sure, there are more than 2 million Arabs who are Israeli citizens. And by the way, it's worth noting that many Arab citizens in Israel, even though the Arab community, at their request, is not subject to conscription into the Israel Defense Force, many Arabs serve in the Israeli army as volunteers, and there are Arabs who are fighting right now in Gaza on behalf of Israel. They're part of the Israeli Defense Forces.
Oh.
So that happens. And just let me make this point on this particular subject, okay? There are over 2 million Arab citizens of Israel. Call them Palestinian Arabs. It's okay with me. There are more than 2 million Palestinian Arabs in Gaza. There are something like 3 million Palestinian Arabs on the West Bank. So let's see, 7 million. And they started off with, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands, but 5, maybe 600,000 in 1948. we keep hearing this term about Israel's been engaged in this genocide against the Arabs. Well, this has got to be the worst possible genocide in the history of humanity, because they've gone from a population of less than 1 million to a population in that small region of close to 8 million people.
Well,
it's hard to understand. It's hard to grasp the suspension of any kind of reality, any kind of logic on the part of people who are accusing Israel of doing all of these things. It's just, you have to be willfully blind to sustain that kind of an argument. I mean, genocide? Come on, guys.
well, there is information that circulates quite frequently among our community, and of course we consider ourselves, as you, people of the book, and which is a derogatory term to some of the insurgents there, the assassins, I guess, or whatever you want to call the invaders of Israel. But it's understood by many of us that follow kind of conservative talk shows and whatever, that when Israel goes to bomb a place or attack, they often warn the citizens of the area to get out of the way. We're coming after your military, and if you don't want to be engaged, please move. Whereas, of course, this October 7th attack was a surprise attack. There was no warning to anybody. And so the idea that you want to hurt civilians, and then people, of course, the left-wing mob is now saying that Israel is conducting this genocidal terror attack against Palestine. But anyway, can you talk to that a little bit, just the difference between the approach to conflict between the Israel Defense Force and the Hamas terrorists?
Well, not only did the terrorists on October the 7th, or any other occasion for that matter, not only did they not give advance warning, they attacked civilian targets. The purpose of terrorism is to terrorize people, and the people that are going to be terrorized are civilians. So they purposely attack civilians, and that's what they did on a very large scale in a number of communities that are in the region of Gaza on October the 7th. So it's not just a question of how do they conduct their military activities. They don't conduct military activities. They attack civilians. That's their target, and the more horrific the attack, the better it is for them in their strategic view, because it's the more horrific the attack, the more terrified the civilian population becomes, and that's what they're trying to achieve. Having said that, you are correct that the Israeli military, and I would say in the Canadian military as well, if they were engaged in this kind of combat, the Americans as well, and the British and etc., when they were in Afghanistan or in Iraq, did the same thing, and that is that they don't want to engage. They don't want to have innocent people suffer the damage and the hurt that comes from military operations. So they will try to the best of their ability to warn civilians in advance of pending military operations that they might be endangered from, in order to give them a chance to move out of that area. It's become somewhat standard operating procedure amongst militaries in the West. And of course, we talk about Israel doing it all the time, because Israel seems to be much more engaged from time to time in these kinds of operations. But let me stress, and I'm saying this as a former military person myself, there is no such thing as a war without collateral damage. And by collateral damage, I mean not just property damage, but people. And this is one of the things that make wars something to be avoided. We live in this day and age, at least some segments of our society, like to indulge again the fantasy that there's such a thing as a cold, clean, clinical war where the only people that ever get involved are the combatants. Well, that went out in the 19th century with the kinds of wars that Napoleon fought, or the kinds of war, for instance, the Plains of Abraham here in Canada, where you had just two armies facing one another in formation on a battlefield. They shot at each other, and civilians never suffered the consequences for it. Well, if you want to turn back to that, that's fine. But I can tell you, it's not going to happen from the Hamas side.
Yeah, for sure. So on a personal level, Josph, did you have relatives in the Holocaust who suffered in the Holocaust, and do you have relatives in Israel today that you know?
Friends and relatives, yes.
Yeah.
It's the Jewish community is a very small community. And I ask people, how many Jews do you think there are in the world? And they always come back with 500 million, 400 million. That no, we haven't reached 20 million. The Jewish community really demographically is only just now emerging from the wreckage of the Holocaust in terms of numbers, etc. So we haven't worldwide even reached 20 million. So it's a very small community. There are very few people in our community who have not been affected on a direct level by what happened on October the 7th, whether by friends or relatives or at a minimum people that we know. And it's the same, both my wife and I, with the Holocaust. It's just terrible.
Yeah.
So the answer is yes, and the world may say never again, and I like to believe that people are sincere when they say that.
Yeah.
But never again, talking about taking on the consequences for the decisions you make and the proclamations you make. Never again really does mean never again if you're faced with a situation like this. And again, I take at face value that people in the world believe when they say never again, but that means standing up and taking action to prevent this kind of thing from happening. And that's what the Israeli government is doing now. They're not depending on anyone else. And I know everybody is saying you have to have a ceasefire, you have to do all of these things. And I'm happy to see that the Israeli government today is digging in its feet and saying, no, we're not. We've listened to that enough. Thank you very much. You're not going to help. We're just going to go on and do what we have to do to protect ourselves and our citizens. And remember, this isn't just Israel. Hamas perpetrates terrorist activities outside of Israel as well. And we haven't even started talking about Hezbollah up in the north, which has a worldwide network and is engaged in horrific terrorist attacks around the world against Jewish targets.
There's a lot of speculation. I think it's probably legitimate that the United States, which has allowed 7 or 8 million, essentially unvetted immigrants into the country. They're not all from Mexico and South America, from all around the world. That America may be setting the stage for an uprising of some sort from people like those in Hamas and Hezbollah.
Well, this is a subject that we haven't talked about yet, Rod, and it's a sensitive topic, to be sure. But that is, where is all of the protesting, etc., coming from here in North America, the United States, Canada, and throughout the Western world? and it's an immigration problem, I'm sorry to say. And I know it's not politically correct to point this out, but again, people it's astonishing how naive people are in this part of the world, that they think that people everywhere else think the same way that they do. But this is not the case. Nobody should be mistaken on the situation in the Middle East. It is not a battle over territory. It's not a battle over borders. It's a battle over ideology and the character and the culture of different people that are clashing. There's Jews who are principally Western oriented in culture, and then there's the Arabs and the Muslims who are not. And their thinking on these things and their calculations are very, very different. They are not interested in a country where Jews or any other religion is equal to theirs, and that is part and parcel of Islam, and the same thing goes here. Now, I believe in freedom of religion, and nobody should say I'm not. What I'm saying isn't a hateful statement. It's just a fact. Okay, it's a very assertive, proselytizing religion. It's the fastest growing religion in the world. It's the fastest growing religion in North America. And we bring in all kinds of people, and we don't think about what their culture is. And, I've heard this for so many years now. Well, when their second and third generations assimilate into Canadian culture. But there is no Canadian culture anymore for them to assimilate in, because largely people who are not very religiously based, they don't have a particular set of cultural principles that they adhere to anymore. So you have this vacuum. Call it a cultural vacuum, call it a vacuum of values in the Western world, and you have to ask yourself which group is organized enough and self-confident enough to fill that vacuum. In this day and age today, Rod, when a young person who feels an aspiration to be religious, they feel spiritual, they have this innate sense that there is a God in the world, and they want to get involved, they are typically going to become Muslim. They're not going to become Christian. Some do. Even fewer become Jewish. But typically they become Muslim, because that is the dominant religion, active religion in North America today. And when it comes to supporting Hamas or any other such organization, if the dispute is between Hamas as a Muslim organization and Israel as a Jewish country, 100 times out of 100, they're going to support Hamas.
It is quite troubling, the calls for, these chants at these rallies get quite disturbing, because, even going as far as gas the Jews and things like that.
Sure.
From the river to the sea, which apparently means wiping Israel off the map and replacing the population with non-Jewish people. So, were you surprised at all at the level of hostility that sprang up in the universities and across the West, or were you would you expect that?
Well, it's probably too much to say that I expected it, but it's not a surprise.
No.
As I'm tell my friends who have contacted me expressing their shock at the degree of anti-Semitism here in North America that has reared its ugly head, and particularly on university campuses, my answer to them is, welcome to my world. We've been saying that this is a problem, a growing problem for many years. And people just sort of shrug their shoulders and they go, well, no, it's not, because well, kumbaya, right? We all have to get along. Well,
Right.
here's the reality. The reality is not everybody wants to get along. And Rod, the problem is a lot deeper than our universities. For just to give you an example, the president of the one of the public service unions, the professional, I can't remember the exact title of the union, but it's the one that deals with professionals, accountants, and stuff like that. The president had to resign and because it was revealed that he had been making anti-Semitic tweets years ago, being 3, 4, 5 years ago, a number of them. And it's not just in our universities. It has become quite and deeply entrenched, and it's extremely troubling. And nobody should think that this is just limited to the universities. It is not. This has become endemic in our society.
Yeah. Well, of
And
course.
I don't know what the solution is, because
Yeah.
I think we may have reached a tipping point already.
What happens in the universities doesn't stay in the universities. The students who graduate and who have been graduating for decades now are the product. I mean, of course, everyone has their own individuality, but to whatever extent they are influenced by their surroundings, they are the product of an environment that already leads towards confusion in the areas of politics, environment, race, gender, and all those things.
Yeah.
So
Well, again, I'm
who
sorry
came
to
out of
interrupt.
universities, are
I
now
want to make the point,
yeah,
Rod. I
yeah,
want to make the point that on some of these issues, there is no confusion. They may be wrong, but they aren't confused about what they want.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Joseph Benamy, well, if you have any final comments how we're going to get out of this mess, that would be great. I don't know if anyone has a simple solution, but I
Well,
told you I wasn't going to take too much of your day, and I don't want to
well,
use your time. So, any final comments for our
yeah.
audience?
I don't know that I don't know that what the solution is, but I do know that if there is a solution, it starts with people like you, Rod, and other people who are listening to this, reasserting themselves, reinvigorating the church in particular. I'm a very strong advocate of the notion that Canada is a Christian country. It was founded by Christians on Christian, okay, fine, call them Judeo-Christian principles. But Canada is a Christian country, and I think that the West is been a Christian culture, and I think that has been a good thing. It hasn't been perfect, but human beings being what they are, they're going to make mistakes, and they're going to do things wrong. That's the way we all are. But generally speaking, I think that if there is a solution to this, what it comes down to is Christians and the churches reasserting themselves and reoccupying the space in the public square that they ought to be filling. It's very nice to say to the government, get out of the church's business, okay? But if that is ever going to happen, then somebody has to fill the void. There is a very strong spiritual void in our culture today, in our country, and throughout Western society. And the church, I think, it has to be, and I use that term very broadly, has to fill that void. If it's not going to fill the void, somebody else is going to do it. And I'll tell you, we, as the Jewish community, we just don't have the numbers or the capacity to do that from a spiritual level. We do what we do, but we're not in the proselytizing business, and that's just the way it is.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you, Josph, for your work in so many areas of our culture, of politics and culture, communications, and especially for being a defender of free speech and of the right for Christians to express themselves for all Canadians, but particularly I know that you have worked to defend the right of Christians to be able to speak freely and not under the censorship which this government seems to be trying to impose on us every day. And but you've been a defender of faith, a defender of freedom of speech, and a defender of human dignity. And thank you for that, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much. It's very kind of you to say, and I appreciate it. And thanks for having me.